So, what is the role of space in a game? I'm going to go through each of these in detail, but first of all, setting the stage, building a language, and variation. So, like I said, we're going to go through each one of these, but let's talk about setting a stage. So, setting the stage, the game is the board, the chessboard, the tennis court, and the game. One of the biggest roles of a game is setting boundaries. So boundaries are the outer limits of the game space. They're what define the in-game versus the out-of-game. So as you see here, these players, all of the game takes place within these bounds. If they leave the bounds of these, leave these boundaries, then they're no longer playing the game. There's a basic understanding between the designer of a game and the player, and that is that all the player needs to know to succeed, or all the player needs to succeed, is provided for them within these knowable boundaries. The knowable is sort of the key. If the player is unclear about where the game world ends, they're unclear about the solutions to any problems, or even the full extent of the problems they might face. Let's see, back to this. Boundaries of a game sort of enclose what's the game designers call the possibility space. Essentially, the space that contains all the possibilities of what could happen within a game. So this includes all the opportunities, tools, strategies, all of the choices the player could make. The possibility space also includes the possibilities for player failure, like all of the threats, the obstacles, and so on. So, boundaries. Next, we'll talk about utility and denial. So, environment can be interacted with. Empty space can be moved into. Objects can be stood on. You can use them as cover from projectiles, taking cover on them. Objects prohibit enemy movement and awareness. They can be climbed, bounced off of, built onto. You can farm a landscape for resources, or any other number of verbs your game allows. Some utility is self-evident, like stairs or ladder. In other cases, utility must be taught or discovered. So the game world often provides a mechanical opportunity for players who know how to use it correctly. So, here's a game you may all be familiar with, Donkey Kong. Take a look here. Of course, the boundaries of the game are defined by the edges of the screen. You can't move beyond the edges of the screen that's outside the game. So everything you need is within these boundaries. And here we've got some pretty obvious utility here. So these long platforms right here, you learn that you can walk left or right on these. And as you can see, if you're downhill from a barrel, it may roll into you. So platforms also have utility for the barrels themselves, which you might argue that they are actors unto themselves, players unto themselves, that are trying to run over the character. And then, as you can see here, also, of course, the ladders. Ladders have utility for gaining the next platform. So there you go. There's utility of platforms, utility of ladder. As you can see, also, like I said, the barrels, which are also actors, which are also players, are able to use these utilities as well. And as you can see right here, there's the barrel is coming right down one of these ladders, blocking you from doing so. So, utility and denial. Let's talk about denial a bit. Environment can get in your way. This is essentially the opposite of utility, a denial of utility. Shapes can block your movement to your goal. They can block your sight, limiting your knowledge, or even your ability to use the space effectively. It may disguise threats, or it could be protecting or providing other opportunities for your enemies. You can see here, we've got some obvious denials. These ladders here are broken, meaning that the player doesn't have the ability to climb them. But unfortunately for the player, the barrels are able to use these as a utility, so it's something you have to watch out for. So that's a denial. But I guess you could also say it's a utility for the barrels. So environment can also be passively hostile, sort of in the form of like hazards like lava or spikes. So obstacles force the player to improvise, to use their mechanics more effectively, and to devise solutions to problems. So we've got boundaries, utility, denial, and lastly, context. So context may be one of the things that we're most familiar with when we're thinking about levels in games. So human beings love stories. They love telling them. They love hearing them. They love seeing spaces that have the possibility of stories in them. Stories have been part of our game since basically the beginning. Even the earliest computer games were, about a ping pong table, a missile command system defense, a racetrack, a pirate island. So, obviously some of the earlier ones, like the arcade games, they're not necessarily complete stories, but context is what's important here. It's a framework for players to be able to fill in the gaps with their own imagination. And it's that context that gives us an emotional connection to the game long after we've stopped playing. The environments we live in the real world, are full of stories about who's lived there, the conflict they've faced, their hopes, their dreams, their goals, just even their day-to-day lives. Fascinating stories and plenty of banal ones as well. And so that's the impression we want to give with our game spaces too. We want worlds that are rich in narrative possibility, that continue forever and ever and contain countless lives and stories far beyond the boundaries of the assigned play space and far beyond like what the story we're actually going to be telling in our games.